What's up? Welcome to the Workout Nerdout. Thank you so much for joining us. Today we've got a couple of topics that I want to talk about, such as rest time between sets. How much time should you be resting between sets? Is there an advantage or disadvantage to resting too much or too little? We'll go into more detail about that. Also, calf glute bridge versus conventional hip thrust. If you spend any time on TikTok or on Instagram, other social media platforms, you probably have noticed the calf glute bridge. This is just a partial hip thrust, and there you see that all the time on TikTok, especially for some of the younger fitness influencers. I didn't think it was that big of a deal, but a lot of them are really loving it. I'm going to be talking about what's the difference between that and a conventional hip thrust, the full range of motion of the hip thrust. Which one is going to give you better results? Is there a difference? Things like that. Finally, RDLs for building the glutes. I knew about RDLs as being one of the top exercises for building the hamstrings, but is it really that great for building the glutes? Does it contribute a lot to glute growth or for strengthening the glutes? We'll go more into detail about that. And in case you didn't know, I'm Julio Lopez. I've got my master's degree in nutrition. I'm also a certified strength and conditioning specialist and a certified personal trainer. Before that, I used to be a collegiate athlete at the University of California, Santa Barbara, Go Gauchos. And I was also a Navy veteran, serving from 2003 to 2007. So let's get started. Let's talk about the rest periods. How much time should you be taking a rest? As you saw in the video right now, there are some people that do believe that you should be resting long periods of time, because if you don't, you're not going to get enough rest to be able to recover enough for the subsequent sets. But there's also the thought that you should only rest somewhere between 60 to 90 seconds, others up to 2 minutes. And like this guy saying that you should be resting 3, 5, sometimes even more minutes of rest between each set. And what is the right amount? So, like I said, longer rest periods means that you're going to be more recovered for the following sets. In that case, if you're lifting really heavy weight, for example, on a leg press, on a squat or deadlift, your body is going to need more time to recover. In that case, resting 3 minutes or up to 5 minutes, sometimes even more, depending on what your goal is, you're going to need that much rest. Also, if you look at the powerlifters from, for example, World's Strongest Man competitions, some of those guys rest up to 15 minutes, some of them even more. That's just because they're deadlifting like 700 or 800 pounds during their training. When they go to competition, they're only doing the one lift, and that's where they do the 1,000-pound deadlifts or 1,000-pound squats. They don't usually go that heavy when they're in training. Because otherwise they're putting themselves at risk during their training workouts, and you don't want to put yourself at a risk of injury when you're at training, because if you get injured while training, you're not going to be able to go on stage and you're not going to be able to get paid. Shorter rests do have their advantages. For example, they increase metabolite accumulation. So that burning sensation that you feel during each repetition, keeping that burning sensation as you're going on is going to help contribute to more hypertrophy. So in other words, that's going to help you build more muscle. Medium length periods, that's somewhere between 60 to 90 seconds. They maintain the greater metabolite accumulation and elevate performance in the following sets. So you're still going to be able to have the metabolite accumulation for that contributes to muscle size growth, the muscle hypertrophy, but you're also going to be more rested and more recovered for the following sets. Again, if you're doing a really heavy set, like a really heavy leg press, hack squat, barbell squat, any of those exercises where you're carrying 400, 500, or doing somewhere that is leaving you ridiculously tired, you're probably going to require more rest regardless. So doing 60 to 90-second rest for those type of exercises, I would actually advise against, just for the sake of safety. You don't want to be injuring yourself during training. There's no benefit to that, and you're only going to be hurting your goals. So what I really mean to say is that there is no one set range of rest that you should be hitting, because it really depends on what it is that you're trying to get and what your goals are. So if you're trying to gain just straight up strength or power, you're going to need more rest, because you're trying to get the absolute best performance for each set. If you're looking for hypertrophy, you're really just looking for the muscle size to grow as much as possible. You're not trying to gain as much strength as you would, even though I do understand that lifting heavier weight can contribute to more hypertrophy growth. That doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be squatting. Anyone that's squatting 1,000 pounds looks like they squat 1,000 pounds. I mean, if you look at some of the guys that have squatted 1,000 pounds, they look nothing like the Phil Heath or Arnold Schwarzenegger types. In fact, you might see them and you'll probably think that that's just fat dude. I guess he kind of looks strong, but you wouldn't expect what you would think in your mind someone that squats 1,000 pounds would look like. Also, you got to look at the type of exercise you're doing. Is it a multi-joint exercise, or is it a single joint exercise? A single joint exercise being something like a leg extension or a leg curl, barbell, arm curls, whether barbell or dumbbells. Those you don't need as much rest, because one, the technique isn't all that important. I mean, with an arm curl, you're really just trying to target the biceps. If you feel that you're going to be jerking way too much as you're getting too tired, all you got to do really is do a preacher curl, and then you could totally isolate the biceps, so you're not going to you won't be sucked into doing the cheat reps while you're doing that. Shorter rest periods are best when you're doing lighter weights or high repetitions, or the combination of both. So a lot of people think that you shouldn't be doing high repetition stuff because that's really just endurance. So yes, it does contribute to muscle endurance, but there is still muscle hypertrophy that's going on, and you're still going to gain strength regardless. What I mean is, if you do dedicate 1 month where you're doing high repetitions, anywhere from like 10 to 15, 15 to 20, 20 to 25, or 25 to 30 repetitions, you're still going to be gaining size in your muscles. It's just not the type 2 muscle fibers as much as it is the type 1 muscle fibers. So in case you didn't know, the type 1 muscle fibers are the ones that are more aligned with endurance. So a lot of times people think anyone that is carrying a lot of type 1 muscle, they're usually more skinny and scrawny. They look like marathon runners, or the 3K runners that you see at the Olympics usually are small in frame. That's not exactly true. You still can grow that type of muscle, and if you're trying to gain more muscle size in general, committing 1 month during each training year, or a couple months during each training year, to high repetition short rest can help build total muscle mass that will help you look bigger and stronger as you're going along with your training than if you only did the standard 8 to 12 repetitions, or 4 to 6, 4 to 8 repetitions. Finally, when you're doing a multi-joint exercise, you're going to need more rest, because there are more muscle regions that are being activated at the same time. That's why you need to make sure that, for safety's sake, you're giving yourself enough time to be 100% for the following set. If you don't, you're probably going to abandoned technique, and in the long run that could contribute to injuries. So for example, if you're trying to use deadlifts during a workout, going to 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 repetitions, and it's somewhat heavy weight, and you're not giving yourself enough time to rest, you're not going to be fully recovered. And that's where you start to see things like the back starting to move around during the following sets that could lead to a lower back injury. Back to how much rest should you be taking between each set. Again, it depends. Is it a single joint or multi-joint exercise? Or is it a high repetition exercise? Is it a low repetition exercise? Are you lifting heavy weights? Or is it somewhere that's in the moderate range? Heavyweight stuff, you're going to need more rest. Multi-joint stuff, you're going to need more rest. Single joint, lighter weight stuff, you don't really need a whole lot of rest, but you just want to feel like you can be fully recovered where you're not putting yourself at risk of an injury. Now, if you recall Louis Simmons, the late founder of Westside Barbell, he would actually promote a lot for his athletes to do cardio because this would contribute to shorter recovery periods. Obviously, those guys weren't going out running miles and miles a day. A lot of it was just hopping on the bike or walking. So that could help reduce the amount of recovery that you need. So there's that. And that brings us to our next topic, the calf glute bridge versus the conventional hip thrust. I'm going to be completely honest. Before I really started doing a lot of TikTok videos, I had never heard of a calf glute bridge. I have done something similar to it, which we would just call it hip thrust pulsing repetitions, where you're just holding the top of the hip thrust and only going down a few inches, keeping the hips high the entire time. I had never used that as a central part of my hip thrust training, but apparently for some fitness influencers all over TikTok, that's something that they do almost exclusively. I even saw one post where a guy had suggested that going down to all the way down to the bottom would make the hip thrust be a more quadricep dominant exercise than it is just a glute focused exercise. I did not find any research that supported this. I had never heard of that. We'll go into that later on. So, like I said earlier, the calf glute bridge is essentially a hip thrust pulse. You're at the top of the repetition, and you're going down maybe 6 or 8 inches before you return back to the top. The theory behind this has to do because the glutes are maximally activated at the top of the hip thrust as opposed to at the bottom. So these influencers think that since you're keeping the hips high when the glutes are maximally activated, that means that you're going to get the most amount of glute growth or strength, if that's what you're going for, by keeping the hips high. This, in my opinion, if your aim is to keep the hips high, I probably wouldn't be doing the calf glute bridge using free weights, because with the free weight version, you're still having to start at the bottom of the hip thrust, pushing the hips all the way up to the top and then keeping them up high. I'd rather have the exercise be done on a Smith machine where you can already start at the top position, pick them up, undo the locks so you could keep the hips high the entire time and not have to worry about starting all the way from the bottom and bringing them up. This could save you from having to get your muscles more tired than they need to, and you can maintain the high glute activation throughout the exercise. Again, the proponents of the calf glute bridge argue that you do get more glute activation with this versus the conventional hip thrust. That is up for debate, and actually the research doesn't support this just because it goes against the commonly shared theory by experts that a longer range of motion uses the most muscle activation. So think of it as if you were to be doing a squat, a deep squat. At the bottom, as you're rising, the muscles are having to work more at the bottom part of the squat than they are when you're returning up to the top. If you notice, as you're from the quarter squat up to the top of the squat, you feel that it's a lot easier than it was when you started from the bottom of the squat up to the middle part of the squat. And that's the whole theory behind using chains or bends. The variable resistance training, those you're carrying more weight as you're reaching the higher part of your squat, so you're still able to maximally activate your quadricep or your leg muscles as you're reaching the top, instead of having the muscles take a break while you're doing that. In the hip thrust, your glutes are maximally stretched at the bottom of the hip thrust, and they get maximally activated when you get to the top. So you're basically forcing your muscles to work from all the way down here, bringing it up. The tension gets higher and higher and higher as you're reaching the top, versus just keeping the hips high for the whole repetition. The benefit with the conventional hip thrust is the longer range of motion, and the research has for decades supported that longer range of motion leads to greater hypertrophy. This has not changed. This is not going to change for the time being until new research shows that shorter range of motion can lead to more muscle activation and muscle hypertrophy. But that doesn't take away from doing shorter range of motion. I mean, if you've heard of partials, you can still gain muscle mass with partial repetitions, which is what a calf glute bridge is. That's why I'm not totally demonizing or discounting the calf glute bridge versus the conventional hip thrust, the full range of motion of the hip thrust. Also, the muscle stress is higher when having to overcome the stretch position to a contracted position. So your muscles have to work for a longer period of time. So if you've looked at muscle fibers, there's a sliding filament theory where you've got fibers that are sliding in and out. When you're at the bottom of a squat, for example, your muscles are stretched out. Same thing going with the bottom of the hip thrust. Your muscles are stretched out. You contract them. They're being contracted. They're being squeezed together. So muscle fibers are actually sliding towards each other. If you're doing a partial repetition like the calf glute bridge, you're really only working this much as opposed to all of this, if that makes sense. I should probably include some kind of animation for that to give you a better visual than just using my fingers for that one. Finally, the great benefit that I do see with the calf glute bridge is that you can overload it versus the conventional hip thrust. So you can be using more weight than you would doing the cast versus doing the conventional hip thrust, because you don't have to worry having to go all the way from the bottom up to the top. Again, you can start with at the top position using a Smith machine, using more weight than you would with a conventional hip thrust, therefore forcing your muscles to have to work overtime for a longer period of time. And if you're doing a higher repetition, like a 12 repetition set, that's going to be a lot of stress that's being put on the glutes, especially with an overloaded weight. So you can, in theory, be developing more muscle mass by doing that. But again, in my professional opinion, should it be calf versus conventional hip thrust? I don't think that's the right argument to make. Both are awesome exercises. So I would say, how about doing calf glute bridge and doing conventional hip thrust? Also doing single leg hip thrust, doing hip thrust with a loop band around the knees. and doing deficit hip thrusts where you've got your feet up on a bench. That I would probably do really lightweight, or just the barbell, or just body weight with a loop band, or doing deficit hip thrusts without a loop band. Also, you got to do hip abductions, hip adductions, RDLs, squats. You got to add all these types of exercise that will help contribute to overall glute growth, so you're hitting all the fibers everywhere and getting the full amount of glute growth or strength growth. And doing the whole thinking of A versus B, B versus C, C versus D is never going to be a good option, especially for strength and conditioning or even with nutrition. Instead, think of doing A, B, C, and D, depending on how much time you're willing to dedicate to the gym, to your workouts. Maybe you'll probably just be able to do A, B, and C. And that's basically all I have to say about the cast glute bridge versus the conventional hip thrust. Stop thinking of this or that. Start thinking this and that. And adding on to the this or that, this and that argument, in case you were wondering, the technical term is dichotomous thinking, where you're thinking of A versus B. You'll probably hear me say that from time to time. I'll try to avoid using ridiculously long words because, one, I'd probably use it in the wrong sense and make myself look like a fool, which I'm trying my best not to do. So that brings us to our third topic, RDLs for building the glutes. The first time I was introduced to RDLs, the Romanian deadlift, was really just for building up the hamstrings. Basically, every single strength and conditioning coach loves the RDLs, actually prefers them versus the conventional deadlift. So in case you didn't know, the RDL is basically you're only going down until the barbell is about just below the kneecap, or a little bit lower, a few inches below the kneecap, no lower than halfway down your shin. Versus the conventional deadlift, that's where you're lifting the barbell off the ground. There's also the sumo deadlift. That one, obviously, with a wide stance. It's been believed that that one would be used more for building up the glutes. It does use the glutes, but basically at the same level as the conventional deadlift or the Romanian deadlift. And it's not a whole lot more growth in the glutes that you're gonna get from the sumo deadlift as you would from doing the other versions of the deadlifts. So how much does the RDL really help out in building up the glutes? The RDL is most commonly used for building up the hamstrings. It's still working the glutes. So when you're going down to the bottom, you'll feel a little bit of a stretch in the glutes. I would suggest when you're doing a deadlift, whether an RDL or a conventional deadlift, trap bar deadlift, anywhere where your stance is about hip width apart, you want to feel like you're digging the big toe into the ground while keeping the feet flat on the floor. Imagine that you're trying to rip that floor apart while keeping those feet flat on the floor. The reason for digging the big toe into the ground is so your feet don't end up coming up like that. What that does is that's actually going to activate the glute medius a lot more, which will help avoid you from letting your knees cave in. So you're not putting any more stress on the knees, and also it involves more glute activity in the exercise. So you're going to be able to lift a heavier weight or do more repetitions, and also be able to help contribute to building more muscle in the posterior chain. So you're going to be getting more glute, more hamstring growth. The reason why RDL is one of my favorites, or basically every strength and conditioning coach's favorites, versus a conventional hip thrust, is that you're not putting anywhere near as much stress on the lower back as you would with a conventional deadlift. If you're in competition, if you're in a powerlifting competition, then of course you have to lift it off the ground, because that's what the competition is all about. I don't know of any competitions that only have a Romanian deadlift. If you find one, then focus only on Romanian deadlift. But if you're training for a competition where you have to do the conventional deadlift, then yes, obviously you have to work on the conventional deadlift, but you don't really want to do it every single training session because you're going to be putting more torque on the lower back regardless. No matter how tight you hold your core, there's always some level of stress that you're putting on the lower back, and the less stress you can put on the lower back, the less likelihood you're giving yourself of injuring your lower back. With the RDL, the goal is not really to bend so much at the knees. Your knee bend will basically stay the same. So really, I like to describe it to my clients as if you had a lasso around the waist and someone is tugging it without bending the knees anymore. The hips are basically just sliding back as opposed to descending like you would with a squat or with the conventional deadlift. So when you're doing these, make sure that you're focusing on that you're pushing your hips back horizontally as opposed to allowing them to drop vertically. As you're dropping the chest down, keeping the back without bending anymore during the repetition, whether you're holding a curved back or a straight back, that it remains the same throughout the entire repetition. You'll probably see some elite powerlifters having a curved back and they're not putting themselves at any risk just because they're maintaining the same curve throughout the repetition. If you want to keep a straight back, you want to make sure that that back stays the same as opposed to letting it start bending when you're going down. It's when you add the bend during the repetition that increases the amount of stress on the lower back and contributes to a lower back injury. The glutes are really only a secondary muscle that's being worked for the exercise. The obvious primary muscle is the hamstring. So the RDL is not going to be the central exercise that you'll be using if glute growth is your goal. It will be a contributing one. So think of it as it's part of your backup workout. So if you follow basketball, you've got your starting five and you've got the six men. The RDL, if your goal is to build bigger glutes, the RDL would be your six man. He'll be your sub to come in that will help contribute with the overall success of reaching your goals. Now, the weaknesses of the RDLs, really it comes down to how you're using them. So again, as I was mentioning earlier, if you're doing high repetitions and you're getting yourself tired, the technique tends to break down, especially as you're getting closer to failure. That's why I usually do not recommend doing any type of deadlift until failure, because as you're reaching your point of failure, technique usually starts to break down when you're around 4 or 5 repetitions before your point of failure. So that's called the RIR, repetitions in reserve. The technique is still safe for you to continue pushing, but once you get to 2 repetitions in your RIR, you're putting yourself at greater risk, and especially if you go all the way to failure, there's a good chance that you're going to be pushing it too much where you're really just trying to get the weight up to the top to complete the full repetition, and technique might not be at its most ideal. So that could contribute to a potential raised risk of injury. The RDL is really more of a secondary exercise. So RDLs alone aren't going to build massive glutes, but they will help contribute to supporting central glute building exercises like the hip thrusts and glute bridges. A person that has a pre-existing back injury might not want to do a whole lot of RDLs, but I would still suggest a person after they see a doctor and maybe work with a physical therapist to continue including RDLs in their training regimen, assuming that they're doing them safely. Say if you just tweaked your back recently and it's nothing major that you don't really have to go see the doctor for, it's just kind of bothering you, I would suggest you include RDLs into your workout plan, but only keeping it with just the barbells or just adding 10-pound plates to it and doing about 8 to 10 repetitions. That way you're still building back the strength in the lower back muscles. If it's a really sharp pain that gives you trouble to go down and tie your shoes or getting something from a bottom drawer, then I would probably hold off from doing that for a couple weeks until the injury starts to heal up. If it's really bad and it's been a couple months and you're still having trouble tying your shoes, then you should definitely consider going to see your doctor. So that does it for RDLs for glutes. Again, I personally do not believe that it should be the central exercise for building up the glutes, but it is 100% a very good exercise to support the glute growth. Not the central one, it's going to be part of the supporting cast. So that does it for today of the Workout Nerd Out. I thank you so much for joining us. I hope that you like and subscribe, and don't forget to share with your friends. Hope you got some value out of what I was talking about today. If you got any more questions and comments, feel free to leave it down in the comment section, and I will see you next time.